That 12-year-old girl has had her life ruined. She's going to spend decades trying to get over this. She's going to spend she's going to spend thousands of pounds and dozens of hours in therapy, and she's always going to have the the kind of implicit trust that you have in your own country, what you don't think about. You just walk around and you assume everything's going to be fine. That trust in her own country has been destroyed by this Afghan man taking from her something that can never be restored.
I want to start by talking about Labour and the recent crackdown on immigration from the Home Secretary. Are you satisfied with this move by the Home Secretary to try and reduce the pull factor from illegal migrants coming into Britain?
I'm not satisfied with the things that she's done, but I am satisfied of the direction of travel of the conversation. The fact that she's interested in extending indefinite leave to remain and reducing all other aspects of the availability of Britain to immigrants, especially what she called the Boris wave, is just indicative that the general consensus has been accepted that actually these people shouldn't be here. They were not. We voted in opposition to immigration, not to increase it, and this is the Labour government conceding that point. And for some reason, they won't just send them home. They should just revoke their licenses to be here, their visas to be here, and just instruct them that they have to leave, actually, because that's really what what the purpose and intention of all of these changes is. So why not just cut to the chase and just explain to them, look, this wasn't something that should have happened, and actually we're going to have to rethink this arrangement.
So you mentioned the Boris wave. This is the wave of migrants that came in between 2020 and 2024. Millions of people. I think net migration was around 3 million in that period, which is a record number. And many of those migrants will be entitled to claim benefits after they get indefinite leave to remain, which is after 5 years. And Labour are deciding to change the system slightly, which will introduce new tests before these people can get indefinite leave to remain, tests of character and things like that. So she has faced some criticism from the right that this doesn't go far enough, and that a lot of people are suspicious that, they're going to give the migrants indefinite leave to remain anyway. One of the other rules that she's put in is that, if you've got a criminal record, you're not eligible for it. So do you think Labour are doing enough on this issue of making sure that these migrants don't have a permanent right to settle in Britain?
No, because the pathway is still open for them to gain a permanent right to settle in Britain. They're just putting various hurdles in their way in the hopes that this incentivizes them to go home. Again, going back to my previous point, if you actually don't want them here, you should just instruct them to leave, rather than fiddling around the edges and hoping that this has a knock-on effect. I think it's worth mentioning as well, you bring up the figures. It possibly is 3 million, but actually the way that we collect this information is actually quite bad and sparse. I mean, you'll be aware, of course, that recently they revised up the number of British nationals who left last year from around 80,000 to over 250,000, because this is purely an estimate that they work on. And this is the problem with the question of how many illegal immigrants are actually in the country, because by far the boat migrants who cross the channel, who cross the English Channel illegally, get the lion's share of media attention on this, but by far the overwhelming number of illegal immigrants are those people who just come here on a visa that is temporary and just overstay it and just don't go home. And this is the problem with allowing large ethnic enclaves in the country, is that these ethnic enclaves become a kind of magnet for this kind of illegal immigration, because they know people in these communities. They can get cash in hand jobs in these communities. They can stay with friends or family members in these communities. And so the estimate is somewhere between 1 and 2 million, but we don't know that. And frankly, if I was going to be quite realistic about my estimate, I would at least double that. It seems that there are way more people in the country than the government is prepared to concede. And we get this information from places like people who deal with waste management and the current spate of fly tipping, mass fly tipping, industrial scale fly tipping that is happening in places like Oxfordshire, this is indicative of a much larger population, and the infrastructure itself is creaking and groaning and struggling to deal with it. If you go on the public transport in this country, if you use the road system, if you try and get an appointment at the NHS or basically with anything, it's pretty overcrowded. And so the facts and the writing is clearly on the wall politically, and the facts are just staring everyone in the face. There are too many people in this country, and we should be decisively encouraging them to leave, which is why it is nice to see the Labour government doing things in this direction. But frankly, we've got to be a lot more blunt about this and just say, look, this has just not worked. This was a complete mistake on our part. We're sorry, and this has to change.
A lot of people think that Labour actually get a huge advantage from immigration politically because so many immigrants vote for the Labour Party. And you can just look at opinion polls and demographics and so on, and that's just a fact that immigrants, second generation immigrants, are far more likely to vote for Labour. But that dynamic is also changing when immigrants are also voting for these independent Muslim MPs and the Green Party and so on. So why do you think Labour are starting to crack down, or appear to starting to crack down on illegal immigration, even on the indefinite leave to remain, when it may hurt them politically? What do you think is going on here?
I think they're going to get hurt politically no matter what happens here, because if you look at the projections for the next election in the constituencies of basically all of the Labour front bench, most of them are looking like they're going to lose their seats. Shabana Mahmood, for example, is going to lose her seat to an independent, what we can just call the sort of Gaza MPs. Jess Phillips is the same, and many others. Wed Streeting, they're all on borrowed time, and they know it. And so the question is, well, who is your constituency if you are a part of the Labour Party? Because you have effectively lost that constituency to Nigel Farage in the white working class because of what is perceived to be, frankly, a giant stab in the back from Labour to that traditional heartland vote. And then you're also losing the immigrant constituency because, frankly, they have very polarised opinions on Israel, and the Labour Party doesn't share those opinions on Israel and has been unable to properly straddle that line to the satisfaction of either party on either side. So the Labour Party is basically losing all of their support in their base constituency. But at the same time, so is the Conservative Party. And so what we're witnessing is essentially the death of 20th century politics and the birth of something new. I mean, many of the polls now suggest that actually, if an election was held tomorrow, it would be a reform landslide with somewhere between 390 and sort of 210 seats. But the second party would be the Liberal Democrats, of all things, which would be a remarkable parliament to see, I think. But it's really, really noticeable to see the collapse of the centre. And that's really what we're seeing. The political agreement that we would have Blairism through the Labour Party in the beginning of the century, and then through David Cameron and the Conservatives, up until about now, in fact, that consensus has just collapsed. People have decided this actually doesn't work. And the problem that they have is that they are not only, both of these parties are not only completely responsible for the position we're in now, they can't point to someone else and say, oh, it was his fault. Because either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party were in charge and presiding over all of this while it was happening. And there was just no other philosophy that was allowed to be aired in the Parliament to make suggestions on the direction of travel of the country. So I'm actually rather optimistic that the Labour Party is going to get crushed at the next election, like the Conservatives got crushed at the last election. And these parties will become a historical relic in future. Who knows what the future will bring?
I want to pick up on something you said earlier about the landfill that we're seeing in Britain and the kind of mass fly tipping that we've seen. There was this incredible story about that river that was completely filled with rubbish.
Can I just correct you?
Sorry,
can I just correct you? It wasn't actually that the river itself was filled with rubbish, but I think it was for about a mile. It was hundreds of tons of semi-processed rubbish, just like literal trash that would be put in a landfill, had been fly tipped near the river. It was only a few meters away from the river. And so the danger is an ecological one from that, because, of course, it's going to be full of chemicals and plastics and whatnot that they think are expected to leach into the river. And the local council just can't afford to clean up hundreds of tons of fly tipped rubbish. And this must have taken place over the course of months as well. It was literally 20 feet high in some places. So this wasn't just locals going and dumping their junk.
No, this was obviously a criminal operation, and as you say, the council would have been bankrupted if they are forced to remove all of this waste. But my question was, did this remind you, or seeing that picture of, say, looking at pictures of India or other third world countries where they do just have massive piles of rubbish and dirt and just disgusting, waste, because the governments either don't care or they don't have the infrastructure to clean this stuff up?
It actually didn't remind me of India. Birmingham reminds me of India, where it's small scale but widespread distribution of just household waste that's just thrown in the streets because the people in the area just don't care about taking care of the area. This was something different. I looked into this, and apparently it's actually a really profitable cartel business. Illegal waste disposal. Now, I wasn't aware of this until very recently when I actually did look into it. But apparently you can make a lot of money by illicitly dumping poorly processed rubbish. And so no, this seems to be something wholly new, frankly. It looked like it had been the product of quite a sophisticated operation. So no, in other areas of the country, yes, but in the particular case of Oxford, no.
Okay, I want to stick on the theme of Labour. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, obviously there's been lots of controversy around this budget that's coming up. But there was a report in the Financial Times that I thought was really interesting and goes to Rachel Reeves's character. I'm going to read from part of the report. The Chancellor was at a kind of event with business people, I think in Scotland, and she was challenged robustly by local business leaders over tea and sandwiches. She is said to have glared at one of the business people gathered and told them, quote, "Talk to me with respect. I'm the Chancellor of the Exchequer."
There's a certain kind of authoritarian personality that thinks that titles honour men instead of men honouring titles. You earn the respect that you receive in the position through the quality of your leadership and the quality of your decisions and the innovative nature of the things that you do. But in Rachel Reeves's case, this is clearly reversed. She clearly thinks, well, I have the title, and therefore everyone has to bow down before it because the title itself is the thing that is important. But that's, of course, not the case. Honestly, though, I imagine that she's in a bit of a bunker mentality at the moment because the new budget is due to come up. They've been delaying it because there's just no good solution to the current paradigm. We're reaching the very end of the extremity of the Blairite paradigm, and she now has to fix with the tools that created the problems that they have created. And so there's just no more wiggle room, and everyone knows that there's no more wiggle room. And so essentially it's more like sort of Chinese state socialism that is the only place left for them to go, and they know that nobody wants that, and it probably won't solve our problems either because we aren't China. So I don't blame her for being quite stressed. I personally would not want her job, just to be clear. So I would suggest that kind of personality reveal is more to do with the pressure that she's under. I'm sure she's a nice person in regular life.
And obviously, the entire Labour government seemed to be under huge amounts of pressure, particularly Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, who is, I think, the most unpopular Prime Minister on record, beating his predecessors, and I mean his immediate predecessors. And it seems each Prime Minister we have just becomes more and more unpopular as time goes on. Do you think that this is to do with Keir Starmer himself, to do with the Labour government, Or is this just more about our overall hatred of politicians?
Yeah, I think that there's a few factors working against Keir Starmer here. I mean, the first is that he personally is not a charismatic man. He is not the sort of person. Weirdly, political leadership in democracies often revolves around, would I like to go for a pint with this person? Boris Johnson is a likable guy, whether you actually like his politics and what he's done in government or not. Donald Trump is the same. Is the kind of person who can command a room, and actually you wouldn't mind having an audience with, because he might say something interesting or funny. Keir Starmer is the opposite of that. He's basically a charisma vacuum who doesn't have a favourite film, he doesn't have a favourite novel, he doesn't read books, he doesn't read poetry. He just travels the world making sure that murderers don't get the death penalty. Yeah, and so he's got that working against him intrinsically. Frankly, it's a quirk of fate that allowed Keir Starmer to become Prime Minister in the first place. It was Nigel Farage challenging the Conservatives for dominance of the right-wing vote in Britain that allowed Keir Starmer to become the Prime Minister. Had Nigel Farage just not been here, the Conservatives would have won yet another election, and we would have limped on for another 5 years with nothing interesting happening. But as it is, we're in a really interesting place, because, as you say, the Labour Party is under a huge amount of pressure because they have no solutions to any of the problems, and anything that they do will not satisfy anyone. It won't satisfy the left, who of course want the sort of radical socialist agenda that the Labour Party talks about being brought into existence. But Shabana Mahmood, in her recent appearance in Parliament, where she was attacking the left using the right-wing talking points, is actually a really great example of this, because up until they became the government, they all believed exactly what people like Carla Denyer were saying. They believe what Zara Sultana was saying. They agree with them in principle, the morals of it. But when you actually connect with reality, if you are actually the party of government, you realise that the abstract ideological nature of your left-wing activist politics, what people often dismissively call just student politicians, well, that doesn't fly when you are actually making decisions that actually impact the rest of the country. People who didn't vote for you and don't agree with you, and yet still have to consent to be governed by you. So if you've got we're going to tax the rich, we're going to tax the rich, you can say that. But as Danny Kruger pointed out in Question Time the other day to Zara Sultana, the rich aren't just helpless babes. They're not just going to hang around and say, take everything I have in order to redistribute it to people who frankly don't deserve it. They're going to take actions of their own, and often that means fleeing. And we, of course, know that in the past year and a half, I think it is, 16,000 millionaires have left the country, and all the student politician Zara Sultana could say is, no, they won't, no, they won't, no, they won't. And she, in fact, had to appeal to those very conservative aspects, saying, well, no, this is their country, this is their culture, they have sentimental connections here. It's like, okay, well, that opens up a much wider argument as to why are we flooding this country with so many foreigners then? Because you're attacking all of those things you're appealing to with mass immigration. But that's a door she didn't mean to open. The point being, they don't have a solid answer to this because it's really happening in front of their eyes. But they're so emotionally and morally committed to this being the only solution for the paradigm that we're in, that they have to just double down and browbeat on this subject. But Shabana Mahmood and the rest of the Labour Party, Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer, they don't have this option. They have to actually govern respectably for everyone in the country. And so you can see the stress on them. They look like they're falling apart. And I mean, I would be shocked if they last till 2029. Because fundamentally, and this is not just a matter of their own incompetence, it's about really legitimacy. The spell that is cast when an election is won is one that says to everyone in the country, okay, we all had a vote. Some people voted for this, some people didn't vote for this, but the people who through the system legitimately form a majority of seats in Parliament get to govern, and we all have to cooperate. Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm looking at the current political landscape, and I don't see where Labour is claiming this legitimacy from. Not only was it kind of false victory because of Farage's interception with the Conservatives, but as you pointed out, being the most unpopular government on record is slightly is sufficient evidence, I would suggest, that actually people don't really want to tolerate this. Because what is actually happening beneath the surface of the country that is the Westminster politics is just blind to, is that there has been essentially a moral revolution against the Blairite system entirely, against sacrificing the nation to GDP, against imposing all sorts of authoritarian speech codes and behaviour codes on the public. And this is actually what I think Nigel Farage's popularity is based in. I don't actually think that a third of the country, as it stands, does actually want Nigel Farage himself, as Nigel Farage, to be the person in charge. I think that a lot of people are voting for reform as a way of sticking it to the status quo, as saying, okay, he's the guy who's been opposed to you for Brexit, and he's opposed to almost all of these things. He's obviously a right-winger of some form. I'm going to vote for him so you understand I don't want what you're trying to do. I think that's why nothing they've done has impacted anything about reforms polling at the moment. The latest one is Nigel Farage was a teenage Hitler or something. It's like, oh, that's very surprising, but it's done nothing to his polling, and it probably won't do anything to his polling, because people aren't doing this because it's Nigel Farage. They're doing it just because he represents a totemic opposition to them.
It's interesting that during the last general election, the one that Labour won by default, I have to say, because the Tory vote collapsed, the Labour vote stayed the same. There was a huge part of that election in which all the media were covering an undercover Channel 4 investigation into a Reform Party volunteer who said some racist comments whilst he was knocking on doors. A volunteer, a man who just turned up and handed out leaflets. And that led the national news, rather than, let's say, issues of the economy or healthcare or immigration. I want to read a headline from the BBC today. An Afghan national has admitted to raping a 12-year-old girl in Nuneaton. Ahmad Mulakil pleaded guilty in Warwick Crown Court to one count of raping a child under the age of 13. This isn't the only case that we've seen of foreign nationals sexually assaulting and raping children and adults in Britain. Actually, this is one of many cases which has led to lots of protests around the country. Carl, can you just assess the issue of migration, how it's impacted Britain in the last 10 years, particularly around the issue of sexual assaults and rapes? Can you put it into its historical context? Can you just assess what's happened over the last 10 years to Britain?
Well, this is, of course, a new phenomenon to Britain, because prior to 1997, we had a very small number of immigrants into the country, numbering in the tens of thousands. Some years it was just net negative migration. And of course, before about 1960, we basically had zero immigration. The country was 99.9% ethnically native. So this is a product of the post-war consensus, and it's not something that our ancestors prior to the 20th century had any experience of. They would doubtless have gone mad if they could hear some of the things that are happening. I mean, the Epping hotel protests are a great example of this, where not one but two of the migrants in the Epping hotels have been convicted of sexually assaulting children or teenagers. And this incensed everyone. And the problem that the government has is that they, through the rubric of human rights, find themselves forced to stand on the side of the rapists. And so people are naturally outraged about this, but there's nowhere that they can go on it. The government isn't prepared to take action on it, and there's nothing that they can do to actually get justice. So this perennial danger, I mean, the fundamental question is, why is there an Afghanistani man in Nuneaton, of all places? Like, I went to university in Coventry. Nuneaton's fairly close. It's just a little market town, very sleepy, normal place where nothing much happens, and that's good. That's how it should be. And yet here we are with an Afghan man put there by policy from the government in this tiny English village where they've got no experience of this and shouldn't have any experience of this. And the thing as well that we say, well, you know, it is true that they're disproportionately likely to be predators on children and women, but when we are saying these things, these words conceal the genuine horror that these individuals have gone through. Like that 12-year-old girl, I've got two daughters. That 12-year-old girl has had her life ruined. She's going to spend decades trying to get over this. She's going to spend she's going to spend thousands of pounds and dozens of hours in therapy. And she's always going to have the kind of implicit trust that you have in your own country, what you don't think about. You just walk around and you assume everything's going to be fine. That trust in her own country has been destroyed by this Afghan man taking from her something that can never be restored. And so once is a tragedy that should never have occurred, and we should do everything in our power to make sure never can occur again. But this is just one of hundreds. I mean, the number of rapes that happen in London, for example, they've tripled in the last, I think it was 15 years. We constantly hear from the Fraser Nelsons of the world, oh, well, crime overall is down, actually. And it may be true that crime overall is down, but if you actually start to look at the statistics more granularly, certain kinds of crime are actually at all-time levels, such as actually stabbings are actually at all-time levels. It's just the number of murders from stabbings have gone down because medical techniques have improved. So we are more capable of saving the lives of those people who have been stabbed. And when it comes to sexual assaults on women, these are just straight up to a point where we've never seen anything like it. I mean, I can't remember the exact numbers, but back in the year 2001, I saw the numbers, and they were about 7,000, I think it was. And I think the most recent one was about 70,000. So we are looking at about a tenfold increase that just happens to correspond with mass immigration into this country. And I'm sorry, but like I said, as a father of two daughters, I would rather go back to the 2001 numbers. Thank you very much.
If you look at research from the Centre for Migration Control, Afghans are 22 times more likely to commit sexual assaults than British people are, if you look at convictions. Why do you think that is? I mean, is there something to do with Afghani culture in particular that is leading them to commit far more crimes, and particularly sexual crimes, than the native British population? Or is everyone the same, all cultures are equal, and this is just right-wing propaganda?
Well, if it were true that all cultures are the same, then what would be the point of diversity? What would multiculturalism even mean if all of these cultures were the same? So implicitly, the left have given away the game here and revealed that they do in fact agree that cultures are in fact different, and differences mean inequalities. Differences mean different outcomes to certain things. And so the question is, does a society that is a tribal society, like Afghanistan, hold non-liberal values when it comes to women, hold non-British values when it comes to how women ought to be treated, and the sanctity of women's person? Well, the answer is quite clearly yes, and you don't need to be much of an anthropologist to have worked out that actually Middle Eastern tribes have a very different opinion on women's position in society than we do, which is something that they don't understand about us and that we don't understand about them. And this is the problem that frankly, it is the liberal intelligentsia in this country have always struggled with, is that they bring people to our country who don't understand us and whom they don't understand. We've got many Somalians in this country, and we are expected to believe that Somali culture is in some way analogous to British culture, to British values. And one would have to ask, how does an Afghan even know what liberalism is? How does a Somalian even know what liberalism is? Because the idea of liberalism, which is the prevailing philosophy of our society, is that nobody is really dependent on one another, and actually everyone should be as independent as possible of anyone else. Well, they would never have that kind of conception. Like, for them, society is something you're embedded in permanently. For them, social strata are something that you're born into and you live your entire life within, and you can't escape. So there's just no way that they can think that women who are autonomous and should be able to make their own decisions, which is why, say, Afghan and Somali women and various other places, I'm just picking these out of a hat, the women in these societies are always something that modern Western feminists complain about. They say, well, look at the way that they treat their women. Yes, I know, because they have a completely different governing philosophy of their society and your place in it, my lady. So perhaps we should accept that these people are so sufficiently different to us in the way that they approach their social lives as to be discriminating as to whether we allow them to not only live here, but live here freely. Because one of the things we do is impose no obligations or restrictions on new immigrants into this country. And if you think about it, that's kind of mad, actually. I mean, I could understand it. It's like, okay, we've taken in 20,000 Frenchmen and 50,000 Dutchmen. Okay, fair enough. Maybe the Frenchmen we need some restrictions, but the Dutchmen should be all right. But if it's other people like who have no experience of our own society, and it's so radically different to their society, I mean, it just seems irresponsible to release them into our society and expect them to get along as if they have been born and raised here. How would they know? How could they know? And this lack of understanding about the boundaries that we expect and that our law enforces from their behavior to women that they do not know is bringing about a real epidemic of crimes that are horrific, like genuinely horrific. Because again, just going back to the word, this person raped that person, that's a tiny word that conceals so much suffering. And I really wish that we could properly explain the problem to the people who are just insistent that no, this isn't a problem, and actually British men are just as bad, and etc., 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 which, as we know, is just not true.
So Michael Gove and others have said that they agree with you in part, I think, that immigration obviously is a huge problem. And the reason that so much of this stuff was allowed to happen was because of a good ideal. It was a good idea. We want to have this together diversity, sort of civilness and cooperation between different groups, multiculturalism. This was all done from a moral place, from a good place. What do you make of that argument that actually you're right, immigration and all this stuff has been bad and there's been huge consequences, but the elites who did it had a noble idea in mind?
I suppose then we get into the more philosophical question of what morality actually consists in. Because this perspective that Michael Gove has put across is what is called deontological ethics, which is ethics that exists purely in reason alone, purely in the realm of the abstract, in the conceptual. And he has to backpedal to this position because in the realm of the consequential, as in the things that have actually happened, lots of immorality has taken place because of the decisions that they've made. And so one would suggest that if your decisions are causing untold levels of human misery and suffering, then perhaps what you're doing is in fact evil and not good. And so Michael Gove has absconded from the position of the consequent to all the way back to the position of the abstract deontological a priori morality, where he says, well, if this maxim is true, then every rational human could agree with it, and therefore it is a good maxim. But that's not true. That's obviously not correct. What the consequent here has done is disproven this kind of morality. And actually, I think that this is one of the real problems. Frankly, I think this is probably the primary philosophical problem that the West has to grapple with at the moment, which is the assumptions that are made by the sort of Kantian liberal moral framework are wrong. Morality is not purely in having a good intention, which is what Michael Gove is appealing to here. It is in actually many different layers. Having a good intention is important, but also having a virtuous method of bringing it about is also important. And actually producing a good result is also a part of morality. And if you fail the test on any of those three parts, then you're not really doing something moral. Because you would stop and say, right, I've caused problems here, or I have done this with ill intentions there, or I have done this in a way that ought not to have been done here, and therefore there's something wrong with the thing that I'm doing. And to persist in this same vein, after you've identified and confirmed and conceded, as Michael Gove has, that actually this was a problem, but still I had the right intentions, is actually a form of vanity, is actually to try and abscond from a position of moral responsibility and say, no, look, you don't need to hold me accountable for the terrible things that I helped bring about because I had good intentions. So sorry, that's not how that works.
Putting Gove to one side, there is also this compassion that those on the left say they have for illegal migrants and what they call asylum seekers who come from broken countries, who come from war, who come from poverty. There was this very long piece in the New Statesman talking about this, which they called The Truth About the Small Boats Crisis, which is that these people come from terrible circumstances. Britain's a wealthy country. We have a responsibility to help them. We have to be compassionate to these people. Okay, that's their argument. My question to you is, where is this same compassion to the native population who are being raped, who are being murdered, who are being attacked, who are being intimidated by illegal migrants? The many cases that we've seen over the last few years, not just young girls being raped, the case of Thomas Roberts stabbed in the heart, 21-year-old Royal Marine by an illegal migrant just a couple of years ago. That's just one example of many of these problems that I'm talking about.
Innumerable cases.
Yeah, so where's the compassion for those people? Is it purely a racial thing? Is it like, well, those people are white, we don't care. These people are brown from the third world. That's what's important to us. What's going on here?
Well, that's a broad question that encompasses many different people with many different agendas. So it's not easy to narrow it down. But there is a slice of the activist class that consists in middle class white left wing activists who genuinely despise their own country because really they feel that their own country has let them down. They hold the same abstract moral standards that Michael Gove holds and are completely and utterly, if we are to take them sincerely, disappointed in the failure to properly bring about a state of affairs that accurately represents what they had in their mind. They believe we essentially should be living in the Garden of Eden, and they view the world in a sort of fallen way, and therefore they do everything they can to cram as many foreigners into our country as possible, because they believe that this will give them a better quality of life, because as you said, it's perceived that we are a rich country. Now, in fact, we are not a rich country. The average wage in this country is horrifically low, and the attempts of people to prosper in this country are hamstrung at every turn by our insane regulatory taxation and taxation burdens. But the people doing this do compare us to somewhere like Somalia, and compared to somewhere like Somalia, yes, we are a richer country, that is true. And so they have this argument that I think they make to themselves, but very often, really, it comes from a position of resentment, a position of hatred of their peers, and often of their fathers, that is really what drives them to this kind of radical left-wing position. And so the argument is in some ways just window dressing for the overthrow of the system that they feel has failed them, even though they've been material beneficiaries from it. And one thing I particularly like as well is when you get the immigrants themselves saying, well, Shabana Mahmood, for example, is trying to pull up the ladder. Well, that's a very revealing sentence, isn't it? Pulling up the ladder suggests that actually they live in a benighted country where they are, and access to our countries is akin to winning the lottery, getting somewhere that is going to, frankly, personally enrich them, which is a very interesting point, because when it came to the decolonization of the British Empire, we were kicked out of these countries. They didn't want us there interfering with their sovereignty, which I personally completely respect. But conversely, that should also mean that then we don't have to take any of them, because they have repudiated us and our style of governance. Now, and that's fine, you don't have to agree with our style of governance. But why should we have to take them after that conversation has happened? That is, these series of events has happened. This should have been really a clean break in many ways.
I want to end the interview by talking about something slightly more trivial, so I apologise for that. But there was this video that put out, or the government put out, about their free school meals for children. And they asked parents what would they do with their extra 30 minutes in the day because they don't have to feed their kids. And people were saying things like, oh, I'm going to go get a coffee and stuff like that. What do you make of this policy of giving school children free school meals, these so-called breakfast clubs, and Labour's promotion of this policy by saying, oh, well, we're giving parents 30 minutes extra to go and have a nice coffee?
Well, I mean, the first and most immediate thing is there's nothing free. That's going to be paid for by the taxpayer. So I'm very tired of the word free. There is nothing that's free. But secondly, the idea that the state should now be feeding children is not something that's traditionally a British way of life. It's a British way of looking at things. Your children are meant to be your responsibility. And so the question is, why is the government interceding in the relationship between the parents and children? Because making your children breakfast in the morning might sound, as you say, like a really trivial thing, but actually what children need is predictability and reliability and time spent with their parents. I know it sounds very, very silly, but the fact, going on my own morning routines, my kids tell me what they want if I'm the one making the breakfast that day, and I can see the joy in their face when they get to choose what cereal they want. And they get to, I'm like, do you want this one? They're like, no, I want this one, and I get them, and they're thrilled. And it's such a small and silly thing, but these connections between people really matter, actually. These are the things that are really where the proper nourishing content of the human experience actually lies. These are the things that your kids will actually remember and feel nostalgia for. They're very unlikely to feel nostalgia for the school lunch lady slopping breakfast onto a tray for them. Anything that intercedes in these relationships is itself bad. And the reason that the Labour government is doing this is just to try and make sure that women can get into the workforce more easily to grow the GDP. Now, I personally don't like my country being purely an extraction project for a set of numbers that I don't even think are accurate to start with, but to balance a ledger on Rachel Reeves's desk. I don't care about the GDP. I care about the quality of life of the people in the country. And if the quality of life is made worse by the fact that both parents now have to work all the hours of the day, to the point where they can't even take the time to feed their children breakfast in the morning, then there's something wrong with modernity itself. We have somehow taken a wrong turn at the kind of society that we wanted to create, and really we should have a proper public discussion about the kind of society we're actually aiming for, and ask ourselves, what is it we actually want? Do we want both parents working 9 to 5 and possibly longer all week? Is that actually the kind of society we want? And if it is, then fine, we've got it. But if it's not, we've got to think about how we're actually going to change society, change the way that things are done, to make sure that that's not the norm. Because it didn't used to be the norm, and it doesn't have to be the norm. Again, all of this is policy. It's a set of choices that we've made, and we could have made different choices.
All right, Carl, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.